Danny stood on the bridge of the Nexus Dawn, watching as Shadow's bioluminescent patterns grew more intense. The young Shadow Maw was calling into the deep void with frequencies that made the ship's hull vibrate. Whatever message it was sending, it was urgent and powerful. "Sir," Wisp reported, electromagnetic voice crackling with concern. "I am detecting massive bioelectric signatures approaching from multiple vectors. Whatever that creature is calling, it is being answered." Commander Pike's voice came through the communication system, filled with barely controlled anger. "Captain Zethkar, order your human to control that creature immediately or we will open fire." "I cannot control Shadow," Danny said, stepping closer to the communication console. "It senses that I am in danger, and it is calling for help the only way it knows how." Through the bridge windows, they could see the Defense Forces cruiser positioning itself for an attack run. Its weapons were already charging, casting an ominous red glow across its hull. But before Pike could give the order to fire, space itself seemed to explode around them. The largest Shadow Maw Danny had ever seen emerged from the darkness between stars. It was ancient and massive, easily 300 meters long, with bioluminescent patterns that covered its entire body like a constellation. Its presence was so overwhelming that both ships' sensors screamed warnings about bioelectric interference. "By the void," Captain Zethkar whispered. "That creature is larger than my ship." The ancient Shadow Maw moved with fluid grace toward the Defense Forces cruiser, but it did not attack. Instead, it positioned itself between the military ship and the Nexus Dawn, creating a living barrier that made it impossible for Pike to target either Shadow or Danny's ship. "All ships, stand down immediately." Pike's voice was tight with fear. "We have multiple hostile contacts. Repeat, stand down and prepare for emergency jump to hyperspace." But Danny could feel something in his mind, a presence that was vast and patient and incredibly old. The ancient Shadow Maw was not hostile. It was curious. It wanted to understand what had happened to create a bond between its offspring and a small human. "Captain," Danny said, "I need to make direct contact with the Elder Shadow Maw. It is the only way to prevent a battle." "Absolutely not," Crix growled. "That creature could destroy this entire ship with a single bioelectric pulse." "It could have already done that if it wanted to," Danny pointed out. "But it has not attacked anyone. It is here because Shadow called for help, and it wants to understand why." Danny could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him as he made his decision. "I am going out there. Shadow trusts me, and I think the Elder will too." "Danny, no." Naira's tentacles curled with distress. "Even if the creature does not mean to hurt you, the bioelectric field around something that large could kill you instantly." "Maybe," Danny admitted. "But if I do nothing, Pike will attack and people will die. I would rather take the risk myself than let others suffer for my choices." Captain Zethkar was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. "If you are determined to do this, then we will support you. But you will take a full environmental suit and maintain constant communication with the ship." Danny suited up quickly, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to attempt. As he prepared to leave the ship, he could hear the crew discussing his chances over the communication system. Even Crix seemed genuinely concerned for his safety. "Rodriguez," the Caltharian warrior said as Danny reached the airlock, "for what it is worth, you have earned my respect. You may be small, but you have the heart of a warrior." Danny smiled inside his helmet. "Thank you, Crix. That means more to me than you know." He launched from the ship in a small EVA unit, propelling himself toward the massive form of the Elder Shadow Maw. Up close, the creature was even more impressive. Its skin was covered with scars that spoke of battles fought across centuries, and its eyes held an intelligence that was alien, but undeniably aware. Shadow moved to intercept him, positioning itself between Danny and the Elder. For a moment, Danny thought the young Shadow Maw was trying to protect him. Then he realized that Shadow was actually introducing him, using its bioluminescent patterns to communicate Danny's identity and the nature of their bond. The Elder, Shadow Maw's response was a complex symphony of light and bioelectric pulses that Danny could feel in his bones. It was like listening to an ancient language that he almost but not quite understood. Gradually, he began to sense meaning in the patterns. The Elder was old, older than human civilization. It had watched species rise and fall across the galaxy, had seen wars fought and peace negotiated between creatures that should have been natural enemies. It had learned that intelligence took many forms, and that cooperation was often more powerful than conflict. Danny removed his helmet, creating a small bubble of atmosphere around his head, just as he had done with Shadow's parent weeks before. The action triggered every safety alarm on his suit, but it also allowed the elder Shadow Maw to sense the gases he breathed and the electromagnetic patterns of his brain. In that moment of contact, Danny felt the full weight of the elder's consciousness touch his mind. It was like standing before an ocean of knowledge and experience that stretched back millions of years. But within that vastness, he also felt something familiar, the same protective instinct that he had sensed from Shadow's parent. The elder Shadow Maw was not just ancient and powerful. It was the matriarch of its species, the keeper of their collective memory and the guardian of their family structures. When Shadow had called for help, it had not just been asking for protection. It had been announcing the formation of a new kind of family, one that included a member of an alien species. Through their connection, Danny began to understand the truth about Shadow Maws. They were not predators in the way that other species understood the term. They were guardians, ancient beings that had appointed themselves as protectors of the trade routes and deep space passages that connected the galaxy's civilizations. For millions of years, they had hunted the things that hunted others, creatures from the dark spaces between stars that fed on the electromagnetic signatures of technology and life. The Shadow Maws had kept these horrors at bay, allowing younger species to develop and spread across the galaxy without ever knowing what threatened them from the void. But their protective nature had been misunderstood. When ships encountered Shadow Maws, they saw only large, powerful creatures and assumed they were being hunted. The resulting conflicts had driven the Shadow Maws to the edges of known space, where they continued their ancient duty in isolation and silence. "You want to show them?" Danny said aloud, his words carrying through the small atmosphere bubble to the Elder's consciousness. "You want the galaxy to understand what you really are." The Elder's response was a pulse of agreement so powerful that it reached both ships. On the Defense Forces cruiser, Commander Pike was frantically trying to understand what was happening as his sensors registered unprecedented levels of organized bioelectric activity. "This is impossible." Pike's voice came through Danny's communication system. "The creature is not attacking. It is communicating?" "Commander," Danny said, floating between Shadow and the Elder Shadow Maw like a tiny bridge between two worlds. "I would like you to meet the real Shadow Maws. They are not the monsters you think they are. They are the guardians that have been protecting all of us for longer than our species have existed." Through his connection with the Elder, Danny began to relay information that had been hidden for millions of years. The Shadow Maws' true history, their role as protectors, their complex family structures, and their willingness to accept new members into their ancient community. As the story unfolded, both ships' crews listened in amazement. Even Pike seemed to understand that everything the galaxy believed about Shadow Maws was wrong. These creatures were not threats to be eliminated, but allies that had been waiting for someone to understand their true nature. "Commander," Captain Zethkar said finally, "I believe we need to contact Galactic Command immediately. This information changes everything we know about one of the galaxy's oldest species." Pike was quiet for several minutes. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its hostile edge. "Rodriguez, can you ask the Shadow Maws if they would be willing to establish formal diplomatic contact with the Galactic Council?" Danny felt the Elder's amusement ripple through their connection. The ancient creature had been waiting for this question for a very long time. Its response was clear and unmistakable. The Shadow Maws had always been ready for peace. They had simply been waiting for someone small enough and brave enough to serve as a bridge between their species and the rest of the galaxy. Months later, Danny stood in the council chambers on Galactic Station 1, wearing the uniform of a senior xenobiologist and carrying the credentials of the first official human Shadow Maw liaison. Behind him, Shadow waited in a specially constructed pool that allowed it to accompany Danny to important meetings. The crew of the Nexus Dawn had all received commendations for their role in establishing first contact with the Shadow Maws. Captain Zethkar had been promoted to Admiral, and even Crix had grudgingly admitted that sometimes the smallest crew member could make the biggest difference. Specialist Rodriguez, the council chairman, said, "Your report on—" The metal chair felt cold against Zektar's back as he sat in the large white room. His 6 arms shook as he looked at the 12 judges sitting across from him. Each judge came from a different world, a different species. They all wanted to hear his story about the humans. Zektar's black eyes moved around the room. The walls showed pictures of destroyed cities and broken spaceships. All of them were Kethani cities and ships, his people's cities and ships. The humans had done this, but not in the way anyone expected. "Please tell us what happened," said Judge Morlin, her blue skin glowing softly. "Start from the beginning." Zektar's throat made a clicking sound. This was how his people showed they were nervous. "The beginning was 3 months ago. My people, the Kethani, had been winning wars for 300 years. We conquered 47 different species. We knew how to fight. We had better weapons and better ships." He stopped talking and touched the scar on his face. A human had given him that scar. The humans live far away from the center of the galaxy. We thought they were weak. They had small ships and old weapons. Their worlds were split into many different groups that fought each other. We thought it would be easy. The judges listened carefully. Some took notes on their computers. Others recorded everything with small floating cameras. "Admiral Cain Martinez commanded the human fleet," Zektar continued. "We knew his name because our spies had been watching the humans for months. He was 50 years old with gray hair and cold blue eyes. Our computer said he was dangerous, but we didn't listen." Zektar stood up and walked to the big window. Outside, he could see ships from many different worlds. They all worked together now because of what the humans had taught them. "Captain Lisa Walker led their ground soldiers," he said. She was young, maybe 30 years old, with short brown hair. She looked small next to our warriors, but appearances lie. "Commander Jake Peterson handled their psychological warfare. We didn't even know what that meant at the time." He turned back to face the judges. Our invasion plan was simple. We had done it 47 times before. First, we would attack from space and destroy their defenses. Then we would land our soldiers and take control of their cities. Finally, their leaders would surrender and we would add another world to our empire. Judge Keller, a tall creature with 4 eyes, leaned forward. "What made this different?" Zektar's clicking sound got louder. "Everything. From the very first moment, everything was wrong. We attacked their colony world called New Austin first. We sent 200 ships against their 12 ships. We had 50,000 soldiers ready to land." He walked back to his chair but didn't sit down. "The space battle lasted only 20 minutes. Their 12 ships were destroyed just like we planned. Our soldiers landed on the planet's surface. The humans had maybe 5,000 defenders. We thought victory would come in a few hours. But it didn't," said Judge Morlin. "No, it didn't." Zektar finally sat down. "The first strange thing happened when we landed. Usually defenders try to hold their cities or important buildings. The humans did something different. They disappeared. The room was very quiet. Everyone wanted to hear what came next. Colonel Steve Murphy commanded their ground forces. Our spies said he was a simple soldier, not very smart. But when our soldiers marched toward their capital city, they found it empty. No defenders, no traps, just empty buildings and quiet streets." Zektar's hands started shaking again. "That's when the real war began. Not the war we knew how to fight. A new kind of war. A war that lived inside our heads." He looked at each judge. "You have to understand something about my people. We think together. Our minds are connected. When one of us feels something, we all feel it a little bit. This has always made us strong in battle. We share courage and strength." "But the humans learned about this," said Judge Keller. "Yes, they studied us for months before we attacked. They knew exactly how our minds worked. And they used it against us." Zektar stood up again. "The first attacks came at night. Not attacks on our bodies, but attacks on our minds." He walked to the center of the room. Major Amy Carter led a group of human soldiers who specialized in night fighting. They didn't try to kill large numbers of our soldiers. Instead, they would catch 1 or 2 soldiers who were alone. But they didn't kill them quickly. The clicking sound got very loud. They would hurt our soldiers in ways that made them scream. Then they would let the screams play on our radio channels. Every soldier heard their friends dying slowly. And because our minds are connected, we all felt their fear and pain. Judge Morlin wrote something on her computer. "This was against the laws of war, was it?" Zektar asked. "They didn't torture prisoners. They didn't attack civilians. They just made sure we heard what happened in battle. But the way they did it was like they reached inside our heads and planted nightmares there." He walked back to the window. "After 3 days, our soldiers started having problems. They couldn't sleep. They jumped at small sounds. They saw enemies that weren't there. Some refused to go on patrol. "What did your commanders do?" asked Judge Keller. "They ordered more attacks. They thought our soldiers were just being weak." But Captain Lisa Walker's Marines had another surprise waiting for us. Zektar touched his scar again. They started using our own voices against us. The room was completely silent now. Somehow they recorded our soldiers talking to their families back home. Happy conversations. Love messages to wives and children. Then they would play these recordings right before they attacked. Our soldiers would hear their own voices saying goodbye to their families, and then humans would come out of the darkness. Zektar's voice became very quiet. My people started to believe that hearing your own voice meant you were about to die. Some soldiers stopped talking completely. Others covered their ears when they heard any voice at all. He turned back to the judges. "This was just the beginning. Just the first week of what you call the human war. I'm here to tell you about the next 3 months. 3 months that changed everything we thought we knew about fighting and fear, and what it means to be the strongest species in the galaxy." Judge Morlin looked at the other judges. "Please continue, Zektar. Tell us about the second week." Zektar clicked his throat one more time. "The second week was when we learned that humans don't just fight wars. They turn the entire battlefield into a living nightmare." Zektar walked to the water machine in the corner of the room. His hand still shook as he filled a small cup. The judges waited patiently while he drank. When he returned to his chair, his black eyes looked tired. "The second week began with what the humans called Operation Silent Thunder," he said. "Sergeant Roy Clark led a small group of only 8 human soldiers. They were fighting against 3,000 of our best warriors in a valley we called Supply Route 7. Judge Keller leaned forward. 8 against 3,000? Yes, but numbers didn't matter to humans the way they mattered to us. Zektar's clicking sound was softer now, almost sad. Roy Clark was 25 years old. He had red hair and green eyes. Our file said he was just a normal soldier, but what he did in that valley changed everything. Zektar closed his eyes for a moment. Our supply trucks had to go through this valley every day. It was the only way to bring food and weapons to our soldiers fighting in the capital city. The valley was 10 miles long with hills on both sides. Perfect for ambush attacks. But Clark didn't use normal ambush tactics, said Judge Morlin. No. Normal tactics would have meant hiding and shooting our trucks. Maybe they could have destroyed a few vehicles before we found them and killed them. Instead, Clark turned the entire valley into a place of ghosts and madness. Zektar stood up and walked to the big screen on the wall. He touched it and a map appeared showing the valley. Clark and his soldiers put speakers in the rocks. Small ones, almost impossible to find. They also put mirrors in strange places and devices that could make sounds travel in different directions. The map showed red dots where the speakers were hidden. There were hundreds of them. The first truck convoy went into the valley at sunrise, Zektar continued. 50 vehicles carrying food and medical supplies. As they drove through, they started hearing voices. Not human voices. Kethani voices. The voices of soldiers who had died in battles on other worlds. Judge Keller's 4 eyes widened. How did they get these recordings? Clark's team had hacked into our memory banks. Every Kethani soldier wears a device that records their last words when they die. It's meant to send final messages to their families. But Clark found these recordings and played them in the valley. Zektar touched the screen again. The map showed sound waves moving through the valley in strange patterns. Our truck drivers heard dead soldiers calling for help. They heard their own friends who had died months ago on different planets. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. And because of our connected minds, every soldier in the convoy felt the fear and confusion of every other soldier. He walked back to his chair, but that was just the beginning. Clark had studied our psychology reports. He knew that Kethani soldiers are afraid of being alone. We fight better when we're together. So he made them feel completely alone even when they were surrounded by friends. How? Asked Judge Morlin. The mirrors. Clark's team put mirrors at exact angles so that when our soldiers looked around, they would see reflections of empty spaces instead of their fellow soldiers. Even when standing next to a friend, a soldier might look to his left and see only empty ground in the mirror. Zektar's voice became quieter. Some soldiers started to believe their friends weren't real. Others thought they themselves were ghosts. The convoy stopped moving. 50 vehicles just sat in the middle of the valley, while the drivers argued about what was real and what wasn't. Judge Keller was taking notes quickly. What happened next? Clark's psychological warfare got worse. His soldiers began making sounds that seemed to come from underground. Scratching noises, digging sounds, voices calling for help from beneath the trucks. Our soldiers became convinced that dead Cathani warriors were trying to claw their way up from underground graves. Zektar walked to the window again. 2 soldiers jumped out of their trucks and started digging in the dirt with their hands. They were trying to save friends they thought were buried alive. But there was nothing there, just dirt and rocks. The convoy never made it through the valley, said Judge Morlin. No. After 6 hours, the drivers turned around and went back, but the damage was already done. Every soldier in that convoy told stories about what they had seen and heard. The stories spread through our army like a disease. Zektar turned back to face the judges. Within 3 days, no Cathani soldier wanted to go through any valley or narrow space. They were afraid of what they might hear or see. Our supply lines began to break down. He sat down again, but Clark wasn't finished. He knew that fear spreads faster when people don't understand what's happening, so he made sure we never understood. What do you mean? Asked Judge Keller. Different convoys experienced different things. Some heard voices of the dead. Others saw impossible reflections in mirrors. Some heard music that seemed to come from inside their own heads. Clark made sure that no 2 groups had exactly the same experience. Zektar's hands started shaking again. This meant our soldiers couldn't prepare for what they might face. They didn't know if they would hear ghosts or see strange visions or experience something completely new. The unknown became more frightening than any real enemy. And this was just one small group of humans, said Judge Morlin. Yes, 8 soldiers in one valley. But the psychological effects spread across our entire army. Zektar stood up and walked to the center of the room. By the end of the 2nd week, we had 3 problems we had never faced before. He held up one finger. First, our soldiers were afraid to travel in small groups, but they were also afraid to travel in large groups because large groups made more noise and attracted more attention from the humans. A 2nd finger went up. Second, our connected minds, which had always made us stronger, were now making us weaker. When one soldier felt fear, all nearby soldiers felt it too. Fear was spreading through our army like poison. The 3rd finger joined the others. Third, our commanders didn't know how to fight an enemy that attacked minds instead of bodies. All our training was about shooting and bombing and taking territory. But how do you shoot a ghost that lives inside your head? Zektar lowered his hand. Major Amy Carter's unit began operating in the capital city during this time. She had studied urban warfare, but she used it in ways we had never seen before. What did she do? Asked Judge Keller. She turned the city into a maze of psychological traps. Her soldiers would move through the buildings at night, but they didn't try to kill our soldiers. Instead, they would rearrange things in small ways. Zektar walked to the screen and touched it again. Now it showed a street map of the human capital city. Our soldiers would wake up in the morning and find that street signs had been changed. Buildings that were red the day before were now blue. Doors that used to be on the left side of buildings were now on the right side. But that's impossible, said Judge Morlin. That's what our soldiers thought too. But Carter's team was very clever. They used holograms and quick-drying paint and modular building pieces. They could change the appearance of an entire city block in just a few hours. Zektar's voice became very quiet. Our soldiers started to believe that the city itself was alive and changing to confuse them. Some refused to leave their camps. Others drew maps of the streets every day to make sure nothing had changed. He walked back to his chair. By the end of the 2nd week, we had lost more than half our fighting effectiveness. Not because our soldiers were dead or wounded, but because they were too afraid and confused to fight properly. And the humans had barely begun, said Judge Keller. Zektar nodded. The 3rd week was when we learned that everything we had experienced so far was just practice. The humans were preparing for something much worse. The room became very quiet as Zektar began to speak about the 3rd week. His 6 arms moved nervously as he remembered what had happened on the industrial moon called Titan's Edge. Our high command decided to open a 2nd front, he said. They thought the humans were getting too comfortable on New Austin. So they sent 15,000 of our best soldiers to attack a human mining operation on Titan's Edge. Judge Morlin looked at her notes. What was on this moon? Rare metals that humans used to build their ships. The moon had only 800 human defenders led by Lieutenant Colonel Dan Foster and Major Kate Sullivan. Our generals thought it would be an easy victory that would make our soldiers feel brave again. Zektar walked to the screen and showed a picture of the moon. It was gray and rocky with huge mining machines everywhere. Dan Foster was 40 years old with black hair and brown eyes. He had fought in 3 wars before this one. Kate Sullivan was 35 with blonde hair and very smart green eyes. Our spy report said they were good soldiers, but nothing special. He touched the screen and the picture changed to show the human base. It was small and looked weak. We attacked at dawn on the first day of the 3rd week. Our ships bombarded the base from space for 2 hours. When the bombardment stopped, there was almost nothing left. Just broken buildings and smoking craters. Judge Keller leaned forward. But the humans weren't there. No, they had evacuated to the mining tunnels underground. This was normal tactical thinking. We expected it. Our soldiers landed and began searching the tunnels. Zektar's clicking sound started again. That's when Foster and Sullivan showed us what real psychological warfare looked like. He walked away from the screen. The mining tunnels went deep into the moon's surface. Hundreds of miles of passages and chambers. Our soldiers had flashlights and sensors, so we weren't worried about getting lost. But something went wrong, said Judge Morlin. Everything went wrong. The first teams went into the tunnels at noon. By sunset, only half of them had come back out. The ones who returned were talking nonsense. They said the tunnels were full of monsters that looked exactly like Cathani soldiers. Zektar sat down and put his head in his hands. Foster and Sullivan had created something we later called the Mirror Protocol. They had covered the tunnel walls with special materials that reflected light in strange ways. "What did your soldiers see?" asked Judge Keller. When they shined their flashlights on the walls, they saw perfect reflections of themselves. But the reflections were doing different things. A soldier might raise his right hand, but his reflection would raise its left hand. Or his reflection might be smiling while he was frowning. Zektar looked up at the judges. "This might not sound frightening to you, but for Cathani soldiers, seeing yourself act in ways you're not acting means you're going insane. In our culture, losing control of your own image is the first sign of madness." He stood up and walked to the center of the room. But Foster and Sullivan made it worse. They programmed the reflection materials to show delayed images. A soldier would move his arm and his reflection would move the same arm 3 seconds later. "Like the reflection was copying him," said Judge Morlin. "Exactly. But sometimes the reflection would move first, and the soldier would feel compelled to copy what his reflection was doing. Some soldiers started having conversations with their own reflections. Others tried to attack the walls to make the false images go away. Zektar's voice became very quiet. 40 soldiers were found sitting in the tunnels, staring at walls and talking to themselves. They had been there for hours, completely lost in conversations with images that weren't real. Judge Keller was writing notes very quickly. What else did the humans do? Major Kate Sullivan created something called the silent zones. In certain parts of the tunnels, she installed sound dampeners that absorbed all noise. When our soldiers walked into these areas, they couldn't hear anything. Not their footsteps, not their breathing, not their heartbeats. Zektar walked to the window. Cathani soldiers depend on sound to know where they are and what's happening around them. When all sound disappears, we become completely disoriented. But Sullivan made it worse by adding whispers that seemed to come from inside our soldiers' heads. "What kind of whispers?" asked Judge Morlin. "The voices of family members back home." But the family members were saying things they would never say. Mothers telling their soldier sons that they were ashamed of them. Wives telling their husbands that they had stopped loving them. Children asking why their fathers had abandoned them. Zektar's hands were shaking badly now. The whispers weren't real. They were computer-generated voices based on recordings Sullivan's intelligence team had gathered. But they sounded exactly like real family members. He turned back to face the judges. Some soldiers tried to answer the whispers. They would have long conversations with voices that only they could hear. Other soldiers would cry or become very angry. A few soldiers tried to dig through the tunnel walls with their bare hands, trying to reach family members they thought were trapped on the other side. "This is psychological torture," said Judge Keller. "But was it?" Zektar asked. "The humans didn't capture our soldiers and force them to listen to these voices. Our soldiers chose to enter the tunnels. They chose to continue moving forward even when strange things started happening. The humans just created an environment and let our soldiers' own minds work against them." He walked back to his chair. By the end of the first day, we had pulled all our soldiers out of the tunnels. Our commanders decided to use explosives to collapse the tunnels and force the humans to come out and fight in the open. "Did that work?" asked Judge Morlin. "No, when we collapsed the tunnels, the humans didn't come out. Instead, they activated something Foster called the Ghost Protocol. Zektar sat down heavily. This was the most terrible thing they did. What was the Ghost Protocol? Asked Judge Keller. The humans had captured 12 of our soldiers during the tunnel fighting. But instead of keeping them as prisoners, they treated their injuries and gave them medical care. Then they released them. The judges looked confused. Judge Moreland said, "And that sounds like mercy, not warfare." That's what we thought too, until we saw what they had done to our soldiers before releasing them. Zektar's voice became almost a whisper. Foster's medical team had carved words into our soldiers' carapaces. Not harmful cuts, just shallow marks that would heal cleanly. What did the words say? Asked Judge Keller. They were messages for other Kithani soldiers. Messages like, "You will join us soon," and "Death is patient and we are waiting for you in the darkness." But the words were carved in our own language. Using our own religious symbols, Zektar stood up again. The released soldiers came back to our base carrying these messages on their bodies. Every soldier who saw them knew that the humans had touched these soldiers, marked them, and sent them back. It was like the humans were saying they could reach any of us whenever they wanted. And then, asked Judge Moreland. Then Sullivan activated the final part of the Ghost Protocol. She used our own communication systems to send pictures of the marked soldiers to every Kithani unit in the galaxy. Zektar walked to the screen and touched it. Pictures appeared showing Kithani soldiers with human writing carved into their shells. Every Kithani soldier everywhere could see that humans had captured our people, marked them like property, and released them. The message was clear. Humans didn't need to kill us. They could take us whenever they wanted, do whatever they wanted to us, and send us back to spread fear among our friends. Judge Keller looked at the pictures. What was the effect? Panic, complete panic throughout our entire military. Soldiers began asking to be transferred away from any area where humans might be present. Some units refused to go on patrol unless they had overwhelming numbers. Others demanded that all captured soldiers be quarantined in case the humans had done something to their minds. Zektar walked back to his chair. By the end of the third week, our army was falling apart. Not because we were losing battles, but because our soldiers were too frightened to fight. The humans had turned fear itself into their most powerful weapon. And there was still more to come, said Judge Moreland. Zektar nodded sadly. The fourth week was when we learned that everything the humans had done on the planets was just preparation. They were getting ready to show us what psychological warfare looked like in space. The room was completely silent as Zektar began the final part of his testimony. All 12 judges leaned forward to hear every word. After our fleet retreated from Kepler 442b, we expected the humans to follow us and attack our homeworlds, Zektar said. Instead, Admiral Martinez sent a message to our high command. He wanted to meet with our leaders to discuss terms. Judge Moreland looked surprised. Terms of surrender? That's what we thought too. But when our admirals met with Martinez on a neutral space station, he said something we never expected. Zektar walked to the screen and showed a picture of the meeting. Human and Kithani officers sat around a large table. Martinez told our leaders that the humans didn't want to conquer us. They wanted to protect us. Judge Keller put down his pen. Protect you from what? That's exactly what Admiral Vorthak asked. Martinez showed us star charts of the dark regions beyond our galaxy, places where human long-range sensors had detected something moving toward us. Zektar touched the screen. The image changed to show a map of the galaxy with red markers at the edge. The humans had been watching these signals for 20 years. Something large was coming from the space between galaxies, something that made human psychological warfare look like children's games. What kind of something? Asked Judge Moreland. Martinez wouldn't say exactly, but he showed us recordings from the few human colonies that had made contact with these beings. The recordings lasted only a few minutes before the colonies went completely silent. Zektar's voice became very quiet. In those recordings, we heard human soldiers screaming in ways we had never heard before. Not screaming from pain or fear, but screaming like their minds were being torn apart from the inside. He walked away from the screen. Martinez explained that humans had developed their psychological warfare techniques to prepare the galaxy for what was coming. They needed other species to understand fear and how to use it as a weapon. So the human attacks on your people were training exercises? Asked Judge Keller. Yes and no. The humans were definitely fighting to defend their colonies, but they were also teaching us lessons about a new kind of warfare. Zektar sat down in his chair. Martinez told our admirals that the beings from outside the galaxy didn't use normal weapons. They attacked mines directly. Judge Morlin was writing notes very quickly. How? The same way humans had attacked us, but much worse. These beings could make entire populations go insane just by being near them. They could turn a planet's own people against each other with nothing but thoughts and ideas. Zektar's clicking sound became very loud. Martinez showed us what happened to the human colony on Far Reach. 20 million people lived there. When the outside beings arrived, the colonists didn't fight them. Instead, they started destroying their own cities and attacking their own families. The beings controlled their minds, asked Judge Keller. Not controlled. That's what made it so terrible. The beings just whispered ideas into people's heads. Small thoughts like, your neighbor is planning to hurt you, or your government is lying to you, or the only way to be safe is to attack first. Zektar stood up and walked to the center of the room. Within 6 months, the Far Reach colony had completely destroyed itself. 20 million people dead, and the outside beings never fired a single weapon. The judges looked shocked. Judge Morlin said, "And the humans think these beings are coming here?" "They know they are. Human deep space sensors have tracked 17 different groups moving toward our galaxy. The first group will arrive in maybe 10 years. Zektar walked to the window and looked out at the ships from many different worlds. That's why Martinez offered us partnership instead of conquest. The humans need allies who understand psychological warfare. They need species who know how to fight with their minds instead of just their weapons." "What did your leaders decide?" asked Judge Keller. "At first, they didn't believe the human warnings. Our admirals thought it was just another psychological trick to make us surrender without fighting." Zektar turned back to face the judges. But then Martinez did something that proved he was telling the truth. "What did he do?" asked Judge Morlin. "He gave us complete access to all human psychological warfare techniques. Every method they had used against us. Every secret weapon and strategy. He even gave us the computer programs they had used to hack our communication systems." Zektar walked back to his chair. "Martinez said that if the humans really wanted to conquer us, they would never share their most powerful weapons. But if they wanted us as allies against a greater threat, they needed us to be as strong as possible." "And that convinced your leaders?" asked Judge Keller. "That and the recordings from Far Reach. When our scientists studied what had happened to that human colony, they realized that our species would be completely helpless against beings who could attack minds directly." Zektar sat down. "Our connected minds, which had always made us strong, would make us very vulnerable to enemies who could plant thoughts and ideas. If one Kethani soldier became convinced that his friends were enemies, that belief would spread to every soldier connected to him." Judge Morlin looked at her notes. "So your people agreed to the human alliance?" "Yes. But more than that, we asked the humans to teach us how to defend against mental attacks. We wanted to learn everything they knew about psychological warfare, both as attackers and as defenders." Zektar stood up one last time. "That's why I'm here today. Not to accuse the humans of war crimes, but to recommend that this council accept their offer of protection." "What offer?" asked Judge Keller. 3 days ago, Admiral Martinez contacted the Galactic Council directly. He offered to share human psychological warfare knowledge with all member species. He also offered to help train our military forces to resist mental attacks. Zektar walked to the screen and showed a new image. It was a picture of human ships working alongside ships from dozens of different species. The humans want to create a galaxy-wide defense network, not to conquer other species, but to protect all of us from the beings that are coming from outside. "And you support this?" asked Judge Morlin. "Completely. I've seen what humans can do when they consider you an enemy. I've also seen what they can do when they consider you an ally." Zektar's voice became strong and clear. "When the outside beings arrive, I want humans fighting beside us, not against us." Judge Keller looked at the other judges. "What evidence do you have that these outside beings are real?" Zektar touched the screen one more time. Now it showed long-range sensor readings from human deep space monitoring stations. The humans have given us complete access to their sensor data. Our own scientists have confirmed that something large is moving toward our galaxy from 17 different directions. We estimate the first contact will happen in 8 to 12 years. "And you believe these beings are hostile?" asked Judge Morlin. "The humans tried to communicate with them when they destroyed Far Reach. The beings' response was to increase their attacks on human colonies. They seem to view any organized civilization as a threat that must be eliminated." Zektar walked back to his chair and sat down. The humans fought us for 3 months and taught us lessons about fear and psychological warfare. But they also showed us mercy and offered us friendship. I believe they are telling the truth about the outside threat. Judge Keller was writing notes. What do you recommend the council do? Accept the human offer immediately, begin training programs for all member species, and prepare our minds for a war unlike anything we have ever experienced. Zektar looked at each judge. The humans turned our invasion into a nightmare because they wanted us to understand what real nightmares look like. They wanted us to be ready for enemies who fight with terror and madness instead of lasers and bombs. And you think this preparation will be enough? Asked Judge Moreland. I think it's our only hope. The beings from outside the galaxy have destroyed every civilization they've encountered for thousands of years. But they've never faced a galaxy that was prepared for psychological warfare. Zektar's clicking sound became soft and rhythmic. The humans have given us weapons we didn't know existed. Weapons made of fear and hope and the power of minds working together. If we use these weapons wisely, we might survive what's coming. Judge Keller looked at his fellow judges. We will consider your testimony carefully, Zektar. Thank you for your honesty. Zektar stood up and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back to face the judges one more time. The humans have a saying, know your enemy and know yourself, and you will never be defeated. They taught us to know ourselves by showing us our deepest fears. Now they want to teach us to know our real enemies. I suggest we let them. The door closed behind Zektar, leaving the judges to decide the fate of the galaxy.